Hello, this is Ursula Bielski, and this is a tour of Bachelors Grove Cemetery in Bremen Township, Illinois. Before beginning your tour, please listen to the following from archaeologist Dan Malone. The Bachelors Grove Landscape, a Path into History. In the northern section of Everton Woods, a nondescript trail leads toward historic Bachelors Grove Cemetery. Situated directly south of 143rd Street, the simple path looks like every other tamed woodland thoroughfare, complete with overgrown side trails extending like river tributaries in every direction, disappearing into thick underbrush. Unlike most trails, however, within the 69,000 acres of forest preserves in Cook County, this is an extension of the Midlothian Turnpike. From horse and cart to motorized vehicles, people traveled this road for 150 years until it was closed off sometime between 1948 and 1950. A new turnpike built just to the north rendered it a simple path leading into the woods. Today, most people who wander down this path are focused on the cemetery. They are unaware that the physical area around them tells its own story that began long before the cemetery existed. This story does not start with the arrival of European explorers in Illinois in 1673, or even with the influential German, Irish, and English settlers of the 1830s. The story rightfully begins with some of the first Illinois residents, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, on a landscape constantly altered and reshaped by succeeding human and natural forces. These prehistoric Native American populations were forceful geomorphic agents, heavily impacting the landscape and ecosystem as they developed their settlement and transportation systems in and around what would become Bachelors Grove Cemetery. In essence, the landscape here is a human-made artifact, an inherited tradition of culture, collective memories, beliefs, and myth carved into the natural environment. It is impossible to precisely know what these memories and beliefs were because these prehistoric people lacked a written language. However, by interpreting the surviving material culture or artifacts and natural landscape, it is possible to make educated guesses. The geographical features of the area were attractive to prehistoric hunting, foraging, and farming communities. They settled on high, well-drained landforms in and around the waterways of the Tinley Creek watershed. These people utilized natural resources such as stone, plants, and animals for tools and food sources. The physical evidence of their existence and survival can still be found on the current landscape. To stand in Bachelors Grove today and walk the path to the cemetery is to have one foot in the present and the other in the distant past. For those who visit the cemetery and surrounding forest preserves, please be respectful of the land and the consecrated ground. Illinois law forbids the removal of prehistoric and historic artifacts and the disturbance of human remains, graves, and cemeteries on state and federally owned lands. The specific laws are outlined for your reference in the Illinois Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act, the Archaeological and Paleontological Resources Protection Act, and other documents. Thank you. To reach Bachelors Grove Cemetery, park in the lot at Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, just inside the entrance on the Midlothian Turnpike portion of 143rd Street. This is just east of Ridgeland Avenue, across from the tall cell towers. Take great care in crossing the busy and dangerous new turnpike road by foot to access the path to the cemetery, a somewhat narrow old road of broken concrete to the right of the cell towers. The path to the cemetery is locked against car access by a secured cable gate and metal signs that read closed and closed at sunset. Please pause here and restart when you reach the path gate. Stand at the gate and restart the recording. You are now standing at the entrance to the path which leads to Bachelors Grove Cemetery. Just inside the entrance, one may still see the old gate post foundations, reminders of a larger gate that once stood here at some unknown time. The path you will be walking was originally a Native American trail, later known as the Old Blue Island Road, then as the Midlothian Turnpike. The turnpike was named for the Midlothian Country Club nearby, which was built by wealthy Chicagoans after the World's Fair of 1893, when the game of golf was introduced to Americans who fell in love with the sport and began to build golf clubs around the nation. It may be difficult to believe it now, but this path was a main public highway until the 1920s. Among the many who used this road were soldiers who marched on it to reach Blue Island and aboard trains headed for duty during the American Civil War. Proceed with care along this broken path, which will lead you to our cemetery. You may now begin your walk. As you travel along, be mindful that the wooded acreage surrounding Bachelors Grove Cemetery is not natural forest. Most of this area was, like much of Chicago, swampy prairie and timberland when it was first squatted upon by early New Englanders who squatted here in the 1830s and harvested the grove timber. After these first arrivals moved on to Blue Island and elsewhere to marry and settle down, farms were cultivated here by German settlers. Mid-19th century maps show a thriving farming community covered with family farms and homesteads, with the timber grove still intact nearby. Today, the woods surrounding Bachelors Grove Cemetery are filled with plant life, including a wide variety of trees, a contagion of buckthorn, the wild onion or Chicago that gave Chicago its name, and the endless twines of immensely thorny brambles. Very little removal is done in these woods, leaving a somewhat precarious expanse, including many dead trees waiting to take their final bow. In most seasons, standing still, one may hear them creaking, which some visitors may mistake for rusty doors on the area's famed phantom farmhouse. The woods are strewn with the remains of several homesteads and farms. Though it's difficult to pinpoint the identity of these sites, there are 3 that have been pretty definitely identified. To your left off this path, the last family to live in these woods. In early spring, before much growth, the clear remains of the home may still be seen. Shards of broken crockery and bottles, pieces of roofing tile, broken bricks and tools, shoe leather, and the sunken foundation of the home itself. A well or cistern is still visible behind the house property as well. Like many of the forest preserves of Cook County, the woods around Bachelors Grove Cemetery have long been a place of refuge for the homeless, the displaced, and the disenfranchised, beginning in the early days of the preserves. During the Great Depression, many of the forest preserves in Cook County were utilized as places of refuge, mostly men without work or shelter. Also here, later in the century, another form of refuge was provided by the sheltering trees, a place of retreat for patients of nearby Oak Forest Hospital, an infirmary for the mentally ill, now closed. According to a lifetime resident of the area well into the late 20th century, patients would regularly spend their weekend good behavior passes in the woods at Bachelors Grove and other local preserves, preferring the beauty and peace of nature to that of their family homes. Others had nowhere else to go, but didn't want to give up their passes, and more than one man allegedly died of exposure during some of these winter outings. Approaching Bachelors Grove Cemetery from the path, it comes up quickly, its chain-link fence looming to the north. Most visitors are startled to lay eyes on the cemetery after hearing of its reputation. The tiny enclave at first barely resembles a cemetery, and certainly not one of such harrowing repute. You should now be approaching Bachelors Grove Cemetery, which you will see on your right. Please pause here until you reach the cemetery gate, then begin the recording again, standing at the gate. Most of the headstones of Bachelors Grove have been stolen or destroyed or long decayed, leaving a largely vacant expanse. Fewer than 24 of them remain. Naturally, those that do have taken on iconic proportions for fans of the cemetery, and they are easily recognized by their shape and known by their family names. The Fulton Stone, the Shield Stone, the Hageman Stone, the Moss, the Patrick, the Deck, the Newman Stone. Some of these are not markers at all, but the bases that remain after the theft of the larger pieces. Most of the markers and bases are made of limestone or granite. Few have more than simple names and dates engraved upon them, many worn away forever. In recent years, the county sent a cleanup crew through the cemetery to remove much of the overgrowth of flora for which the burial ground was famous. Once upon a time, the cemetery was known for its flowers and trees. Hundreds of lilies and other flowers would cover the grounds, flanked by rose bushes, shrubs, and stately oak, cedars, and other mature trees. After the private trustees left, the lushness of nature took over, and in high summer, Illinois prairie flowers and grass were commonly waist high, blotting out most of the cemetery monuments. In September, a froth of snowy blooms turned the enclave into a sea of white. Vines, covering the trunks of the standing trees, daylilies and periwinkle, long ago planted by kind visitors, helped to buoy the fragile stones. Since the cleanup and the apparent scrapping of restoration plans, dangerous and quick erosion has threatened the remaining standing stones, soil washing away at alarming rates with the spring rains, and one whole perimeter stretch threatens to cave in at any moment. The flood of 2013 added insult to injury. The Fulton stone, in particular, was already being reinforced by visitors who would wedge small rocks and pieces of broken concrete underneath the base stone to stave off inevitable instability. After the flooding and erosion of the last few years, one visitor reinforced the base with stones and dirt carried by buckets from the creek bed nearby. There are 82 lots at Bachelors Grove Cemetery. Historians have in the past estimated that there were between 135 and 200 burials in the cemetery between 1838 and 1989. Unfortunately, again, there are no known burial records for Bachelors Grove. The only known notations made by the trustees were of ownership or transfers of the lots, and these only beginning after 1860, more than 2 decades after the first known burials. Therefore, creating a picture of the actual interments and taking into account the possibility of undiscovered reinterments is, in short, a pretty much impossible task. Heroic attempts to make sense of the situation were made twice before. First, Bremen High School students and teachers read the stones and researched the graves as part of their bicentennial history project of 1976. One of the students, Mark Preston, came to believe that the cemetery is older than has been believed, possibly dating to 1832 or even earlier. In 1994, Tinley Park historian Brad Bettenhausen published a heroic lot breakdown of the cemetery, listing all known information about the burials. Unfortunately, the excellent detailed diagram which was produced from this effort has been widely misinterpreted. Many lot notations indicating ownership or sales have been interpreted as actual burial records on internet cemetery record sites, which in turn have been utilized by family historians, spreading the information through ancestry and genealogy sites. Often, it seems, these lots were transferred or abandoned altogether as the original owners went on to other settlement areas, and yet the original owners are frequently listed as interred at Bachelors Grove. For the past several years, Bachelors Grove historian Wendy Moxley Rowe and I have separately and together attempted to track down as much actual burial documentation as possible in order to present a more accurate picture of the interments at the Grove. Starting with Mr. Bettenhausen's record and incorporating county vital records, funeral home registries, obituaries, and other newspaper articles, and public and private family trees, we have come to a current understanding of the existing burials. Though many of the graves around the perimeter of the cemetery are listed on the ownership map as unsold and presumably empty, in the spring of 2016, we surveyed the cemetery with dowsing rods and confirmed dozens of additional burials in these unsold lots. Many of the lots seem to be actually full, containing 9 or more burials. There's literally no way of knowing the occupants of these graves at this time. Unless a burial registry surfaces in the future, we cannot know. One possibility is that these perimeter lots were reserved as paupers' graves. We also confirmed that there were several burials outside of the modern fence, at least to the south and west. Whether these burials are part of marked lots is unknown at this time. With the additional findings and presuming no unknown reinterments, this would put the burials at Bachelors Grove at over 170 persons, and possibly as many as 200 or more. Despite the numbers, there are fewer than 20 headstones, markers, or bases remaining today. It is highly probable that many graves were never marked or only marked with wooden markers on inscribed rocks or saplings, such as those of the twin cedar trees that still stand today. Our tour of the cemetery will proceed now through the 4 quadrants of the cemetery, starting with the first or southeast quadrant to your right as you enter the cemetery. Please take great care as you walk. Entering the cemetery from the path or the old turnpike road, the visitor encounters the largest grouping of stones in the burying ground. These are also the earliest burials here. The remains of the markers nearest the entrance are believed to be the remnants of Fulton Family stones, from the fence to the stone marked Wheeler. John Fulton Sr. and his wife, Jane Johnson, were both born in Ireland and immigrated to America in 1839. They made their way west to the burgeoning Illinois lands outside of Chicago, where they purchased 80 acres of the wooded area of Bremen Township, known then as Bachelors Grove. The couple bore 14 children on the farm they operated in Bremen. At the time of his death in 1883, John Fulton had become the most influential and respected of the area's citizens, owning more than 1,000 acres of land, with his family closely tied to the administration of the community, as his descendants still are in Tinley Park today. The young couple were raising their family in the recent Indian lands of the Illinois Wilds, and local Native Americans would come each morning to the Fulton farm for milk, often returning after the day's hunt with a cut of deer meat for Jane to prepare for the family. During the building of the Rock Island Railroad, the Fultons boarded the workers for 10 cents a day, including meals and free lodging. 2 of John and Jane's children, Ella and Robert, are also interred here. According to local oral history, Robert committed suicide at the age of 31 by walking in front of a Rock Island train near present-day Tinley Park sometime before 1935. Ella's husband, Chauncey Wheeler, also rests here with his wife, their graves marked by the Wheeler marker, often toppled. Amazingly, Joseph Fulton, born in the 1770s, is also interred here. He was the father of John Sr. and of Hamilton Fulton. According to old records, a large white obelisk once stood here, reading, Joseph Fulton, died 15 October 1852 at the age of 80. Near the Fultons is the iconic moss marker, which is only the base of a complete marker that once towered here. However, when family members found that the granite obelisk topping the base had been dragged nearly to the road, the marker was given to the care of the Tinley Park Historical Society, cleaned and placed outside the society headquarters at the old landmark church, where it still may be seen today. Thomas Moss's life, like that of many residents of the Grove, was often visited by death. His first wife, Isabella, died in 1848 after a 13-year marriage. The couple had 7 children, 2 of whom were stillborn, and 2 of whom died in childhood. After Isabella's death, Thomas married Sarah McGettigan, who passed away less than a year later. 2 years later, Thomas wed again. His third wife, Anna Turney, was the sister of Huldah Turney Fulton, buried under the famed Fulton Stone here near the Quarry Pond. This third marriage produced 7 more children, of whom 1 was stillborn and 2 died in infancy. Then, in 1885, Anna and her last child died in childbirth. Thomas never married again. Isabella is buried here with him. Also in this quadrant are the lots of the Crandall family, now unmarked. The Crandall brothers were some of the most colorful characters in Cook County in its earliest days, well known at Chicago, and not a little notorious. In 1833, Heman Crandall, then 21, left the shores of Lake Champlain in New York and walked more than 800 miles to Chicago. He also went back and forth on visits twice more on foot. 2 of his brothers, David and Mark, made the journey to Chicago by canoe, and at the first government land sale in Illinois, held at the Bull's Head Tavern on Lake Michigan, the brothers purchased prairie lands in Bremen Township for $1.25 an acre. Some of the Crandalls went on to settle in present-day Worth, then called Lane's Island, building the first houses there. The Crandalls were typical of the very earliest settlers here, who spent most of their lives not as farmers but as loggers, moving west with the expanding frontier. When he was 69 years old, Ben Crandall went on to Nebraska, where he purchased a substantial tract of largely unimproved land, intending to divide it among his children. Returning later to Bremen Township, he continued to farm until his death in his late 70s. Mark Crandall's daughter, Alma, was only 16 years old at the time of her death and burial at Bachelors Grove in 1870. A surviving daughter, Electa, lost her own daughter, Clara Weber, when the infant was only 3 weeks old. She was also buried at Bachelors Grove. Several of the Crandall family members interred at the Grove were reinterred at Mount Greenwood Cemetery in Blue Island in 1895 on the same day. It is uncertain if any of the grave markers on the Crandall family lot at Mount Greenwood originally stood here. In 1935, however, at least one Crandall grave marker remained at the Grove, that of Alva Crandall, who died in July 1843 at the age of 39. His stone was still present in 1935 when it was mentioned in a newspaper article. No reinterment records exist for Alva. It is presumed he remains here at the Grove. Lot 43 is home to settler Richard Moss and family, including wife Maria and numerous children and spouses. There are 3 stones remaining, including Richard's headstone showing his name and dates. A landmark here on the lot until very recently was the split tree, which was strangely beloved by visitors. Its double trunk split almost to the ground for years. A friend of the Grove in its last year chained the trunks together, hoping to keep them from falling apart, but county maintenance crews finally sawed them down to the stumps. Remaining at their base, however, are the twin markers of John McKee and Delaney Ann Hewlett McKee. Born in 1854 to pioneer parents, Delaney Ann was a 25-year veteran school teacher in Cook County, including at the famed Stone School at Bachelors Grove. She died in 1920. Nearby is the lot of the Patrick family, which is home of the famed moving tombstone, one of the most recognizable stones at Bachelors Grove, which is said to move to different locations around the cemetery on its own. One of the earliest known photos of Bachelors Grove Cemetery, which appeared in a local paper in 1951 and refers to the burial ground as Smith's Cemetery, shows that the stone had by then already moved from its appointed spot. But keep in mind that this was several years after vandalism began at the Grove, so one assumes that it was vandals and not spirits who first began to move it. The Patrick family's most famous member was Amelia Patrick, who married Senator John Humphrey. His Humphrey House Historical Museum still operates in Orland Park. Amelia and John's infant daughter, Libby May Humphrey, rests at Bachelors Grove. Past the cedar trees known as the pines is the stone marking the Rippett family lot, which was last photographed upright in 1951. The Rippetts were dairy farmers in Blue Island, and James Rippett was a Blue Island police officer. The farming members moved to Oregon, Illinois later in life. In the very far corner of this quadrant is the lot marked by the stone of William Hamilton, whose identity remains unknown. Though other Hamiltons are buried elsewhere in the cemetery, we do not at this time know if this is a relation, as burial records for a related William do not match up. This plot is, however, believed to be the burial site of one of the oldest known burials here, that of William B. Nobles in 1836, but his marker is long gone. We are now entering the second quadrant. Continuing north along the east fence wall, visitors can see the severe erosion that began after the flood of 2013, worsened by the recent removal of wild and cultivated plants that helped to curtail earlier erosion. Along the fence line of the northeast quadrant, the ground slopes dangerously down into a small stream of runoff water. In this quadrant, visitors find the lots of the Deck family and the Shields family. Joseph and Jenny Deck Nicholas were 2 of 5 members killed in July of 1921 when their car stalled on tracks at 90th Street and Vincennes Avenue and was struck by a freight train. Jenny's parents, Jacob and Mary, and brother Bernard, rest here as well. Edna Wright Hardy Sanderson is in an unmarked grave in this quadrant at Bachelors Grove, alone. An English native, she bore 17 children, several of whom came to Bremen Township to live. Edna visited Chicago during the World's Fair of 1893 after the death of her husband. Returning to England and remarrying, she again visited Bremen Township after her second husband's death. During that visit, in 1909, Edna became too ill to return home. She passed away and was interred here at Bachelors Grove. Her son Albert lived over the creek, likely in the house whose foundation may still be seen there today. Her mother was originally interred here but was moved to the family's plot in town, where Albert and her children are also interred. This woman then, with 2 fruitful marriages and 17 children, is alone at Bachelors Grove, an ocean away from home. The last known burial at Bachelors Grove was in this quadrant, at the Shields family lot. You may easily see the Shield stone, one of the largest still remaining at Bachelors Grove, though it toppled long ago. The burial was of the ashes of Robert Shields in 1989, when mortician Clay Krieger made the trek to the cemetery with a family friend to inter the remains. We are now entering the 3rd northwest quadrant. The northwest quadrant of the cemetery houses 2 important sites for visitors, the Fulton Stone and the entrance to the Quarry Pond. Before you reach the Fulton Stone, you'll see some of the only coping or stone fencing found in the cemetery today, marking more mysterious graves. Original cemetery plat notations assign these to Louis and Johanna Buch, but while there was a couple with these names living nearby, they farmed in Palos and are buried in Worth. No burial records have been found for this lot, though a 1935 newspaper article describes a headstone or headstones indicating that the Buchs are indeed interred here. A map of the cemetery showing transfers of the lot shows an L. Brock as the original owner, with the Buchs listed beneath. I found a pioneer named John Bach, an Americanized version of Buch, on the 1880 census, living in Bremen Township with his son, Louis. They were both farmers and widowers. Louis was only 40 at the time. It is almost certainly this Louis Bach who is interred here, along with his wife. It's almost also certain that John Bach, or Buch, was interred here, perhaps with his own wife. If the elders ever had headstones, they were gone by 1935. Also look nearby for the stone marking the lot of the John Hamilton family. The stone that resides here today was stolen at an undetermined time in the past, but recovered in a recent summer, when a Bachelors Grove historian was contacted by a Joliet man who had found it in his backyard years before, but had no idea where it belonged. When it was discovered that it belonged at the Grove, he contacted a cemetery advocate who returned it to its proper location on the cemetery grounds. William Hamilton, John's father, was one of the first bachelors to settle Bachelors Grove. He traveled to New York City from County Down, Ireland, around 1830, and he and Dexter Gilson, another original settler, boarded together in a cabin near here before starting their own families. Gilson hosted one of the area's first schools on his homestead nearby. The most famous stone at Bachelors Grove Cemetery is also the largest of the few still standing. The Fulton Stone has stood through generations of varying tranquility and turmoil, not unlike the dynamic family interred below. The Fulton family stone stands on an increasingly unstable base where the path splits, one artery leading into the cemetery's northwest quadrant and the other down to the old quarry behind the northern fence. Several years ago, a kind caretaker of the cemetery reinforced the base with stones and sand carried by hand in buckets from the nearby creek bed. The Fultons would emerge as one of the most important and influential families of Bachelors Grove and Tinley Park. An extensive network of parents, siblings, children, and grandchildren, the Fulton line still thrives in Tinley Park today and even became world famous through marriage into the Bettenhausen family of racing fame. One of the children of John Fulton Sr., John Fulton Jr., was interred at Bachelors Grove after his death in 1922. The dates on the stone silently tell some of the tragic family story of the Fultons. Though infant and child mortality was high at the time they lived, the Fultons experienced more than their share, losing son Johnny B. at the age of 10 and an older son Frank at 32. John's brother Robert Fulton took his own life by throwing himself in front of a train at the age of 31. Daughter Luella Fulton was struck by a hit-and-run driver in the 1940s while walking on Oak Park Avenue, known then as Bachelor Grove Road. She was 65 years old. Abandoned in a ditch, her cries were finally heard by a passerby, but Luella died of internal injuries in a nearby hospital. Today, thousands of visitors each year make the ritualistic visit to the Fulton Stone, many bringing toys, candy, stuffed animals, and flowers to place at the attendant stone reading Infant Daughter, which marks the grave of little Marcy May Fulton, daughter of John and Huldah's son, Bert Fulton, and his wife, Catherine Vogt. She was formerly known as Marcia due to public records. However, family records identify that the infant's name was actually Marcy. The Vogt family was one of the most important families in Bremen Township, but according to local historians, the Fultons and Vogts did not get along very well at the time, and the Vogts did not approve of their daughter's marriage to Bert. Marrying anyway, the two gave birth to a daughter who perished. Though the Vogts owned a large mausoleum, which may still be seen today in Tinley Park's Zion Lutheran Cemetery, the child was buried at the Fulton lot at Bachelors Grove. Years later, after her own death, Catherine was interred in town, far from her infant child. The stone of little Emma Fulton, aged 11 days, was also placed here upon her death and burial at the lot, then was stolen from Bachelors Grove, but recovered. Today, it is in the care of the Tinley Park Historical Society. The stone, in excellent condition due to its sheltered location, reads, "God's lovely bud, so young and fair." As time moved on, later Fultons began to choose burial in town at Zion Lutheran Cemetery, where numerous children and grandchildren are interred. A cenotaph, or memorial stone placed in Tinley Park's Zion Cemetery, commemorates the Fultons buried here at Bachelors Grove, though no bodies have been removed. Just past the Fulton Stone, beyond the stretch of fence, lies the old quarry, now filled with dark water, which hosts a famously bright green covering of duckweed in the summer. Take great care if you choose to step down the broken stones and tree roots to the quarry's edge, as its depths are unknown at this time. One investigator, Dr. Chuck Kennedy, sent down a device of his own invention to record sound and video underwater and verify depths of at least 50 feet. However, other observers have claimed that the pond is shallow. In a recent summer, one local resident watched a young boy hunting toads and reported that he walked all the way across and reported a depth of 6 feet at most. However, quarries are known for their various and sudden depth changes, so unless divers are sent down to explore or the pond is drained, the true dimensions and mysterious contents may never be known. Local legends suggest that many of the cemetery's missing headstones may lie at the quarry floor. In fact, Wendy Moxley Rowe and myself have both heard locals tell that their ancestors threw their headstones of their loved ones into the quarry, fearful of vandals stealing or defacing them, or worse, digging up their loved ones' graves. One stone was hauled up close to shore by a group of volunteers in the early 2000s. Some have lived in hope that the county will drain the quarry and discovered the rumored remains at the bottom: automobiles, missing tombstones, plows, bodies, and other whispered artifacts of legends past, as well as the true dimensions of it. The quarry is the site of many of Bachelors Grove's haunting legends, including stories of gangland body dumps, a phantom farmer and plow horse believed to have plunged into the depths, and a phantom house seen on the ravine to the west near the creek, a drainage artery of the Tinley Creek, originally called Bachelors Grove Creek, which runs all the way through Everton Woods. When this was farmland, there were bridges crossing the creek at the Turnpike Road and at other points throughout the acreage where homesteads once stood. Today, there are no bridges. Hikers generally cross the creek across the rocks of the creek bed where a footpath dips down from the path, west of the cemetery, the old Turnpike Road. You may view the creek from the old Turnpike Road after this tour ends by turning right as you leave the cemetery entrance. Nothing was known about the origins of this quarry even by local historians until the winter of 2016 when I came across an extraordinary document in the archives of the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, a 115-page court hearing transcript concerning none other than the quarry here at Bachelors Grove. Their hearing was held in 1928 over a dispute regarding the land on which the quarry is housed. Christian Bohm, the owner of the land, had been offered $1,000 for the land as part of the massive development of the forest preserves in the mid to late 1920s. A series of handwritten notes are included in the Bohm file in which he contended that the price offered was much too low considering the improvements he had made on the land, improvements that included a house and a stone quarry. The dispute arose because at the time of the survey of the land by the Forest Preserve District, the quarry was filled with water, having been out of service for an unspecified number of years. Bohm had moved to Knox, Indiana, and was renting out the Bachelors Grove house to a local resident. A hearing was thus held, calling in witnesses to determine whether, in fact, the water-filled hole in the ground was indeed a quarry, and if so, what sort of value it held. During the testimony, Bohm said he had started the quarry around 1909, which was the year before the land was deeded by the Schmidts to Friedrich Bohm, Christian's father, according to the warranty deed drawn up for the sale of the Schmidt land to the Forest Preserve in 1927. Turn back to the cemetery now and continue along the western fence. Also in this northwest quadrant, to the left of the cemetery path, is the lot of the Warren family. Ezra Snow Warren and his wife Suzanne Lamson went west from Vermont in the 1840s, having been given a wagon, a team of oxen, and $500 in gold by their fathers as wedding gifts. Family tradition holds that Susan was a cousin of President Martin Van Buren. Ezra and Susan had two sons who fought in the American Civil War. Stephen was enlisted for only 3 months, from July to October of 1862. Richard was captured at the Battle of Warebottom Church in Virginia in June of 1864. He was incarcerated at Andersonville Prison, Fort Sumter, and was mustered out in December of 1865 in Norfolk, Virginia. Richard went on to marry Charlotte Hatch. They had a daughter, also Charlotte, in 1868. Family stories say Richard was never the same after the war, and he died of tuberculosis at the age of 30. Please note as you walk that many unmarked graves remain here. The majority of them are believed to be those of indigent residents of Cook County and possibly some patients of the nearby Old Oak Forest Hospital. We now enter the final fourth quadrant, the southwest sector. Here lies the Newman family, near the western fence. Dora Flossick Newman was born in 1870 to Frank and Dora Flossick, a large Bachelors Grove family. Daniel Newman, Dora's husband, was the son of John and Rosanna Turney Newman. Rosanna was the sister of Huldah Turney Fulton, buried at the large Fulton stone here at Bachelors Grove. In the very corner of this quadrant is the last known lot at Bachelors Grove. Unmarked, it holds members of the Newman, Stratzenberg, or Sturzenberg families, including Hattie Teresa Stratzenberg Adams and her infant children. In the final corner of this quadrant is the last known lot at Bachelors Grove. Unmarked, it holds members of the Newman, Stratzenberg, or Sturzenberg families, including Hattie Teresa Stratzenberg Adams and her infant children. Also here, next to a tree stump, is the lot of James Fullerton, a Blue Island farmer born in Scotland. He met his wife, Sarah Chapman, in England in the 1860s, and the two immigrated to Illinois, where James farmed until his death. They are interred here at Bachelors Grove together. Across the path from the couple is the famed checkered stone or quilted stone, the scene where the famed Madonna of Bachelors Grove photo was taken in 1991, one of the most famous ghost photos of all time. The photo was captured by Judy Huff during an afternoon paranormal investigation with the Ghost Research Society. This is believed to possibly be the base stone of a now vanished monument to members of the Rick family. At the cemetery entrance in this quadrant is the lot of the Hageman and Kuhl families, some of the earliest German settlers in Bremen Township, though the Kuhls were reinterred elsewhere. Jane Nobles Kuhl was the daughter of William Nobles, the first known burial here. Many other individuals remain here at Bachelors Grove, both under these stones and in unmarked graves. The process of learning about them all is an ongoing one. These stories have been shared to give visitors a general idea of the community whose burial ground this was and is, and a look into the lives of courage and tragedy they endured. This concludes our tour of Bachelors Grove Cemetery. To extend your tour of the area, exit the cemetery entrance and turn right down the path, walking for a brief time. At the end of the path, you will find the creek. If the creek is low or dry, you may be able to carefully cross it to the woods beyond. Take great care if you do, as the woods on the other side are very overgrown and the path disappears. It is very easy to get lost here. Across the creek are the remains of what was likely the home of Albert Hardy, who came to Bremen Township from Liverpool in the 19th century, and whose mother, Edna Wright Hardy Sanderson, is buried at Bachelors Grove. Thank you for joining this tour of Bachelors Grove Cemetery. For a map of the cemetery, a full list of known burials, and an essay on the natural life of Bachelors Grove by naturalist Joey Cavatayo, please email me at chicagoghosttours@gmail.com. Music for this program was provided by The Dark Piano, Mew by Nicholas Gasparini, www.thedarkpiano.com via Creative Commons, and by Wojciech Arsusowicz, Dreams, from gemendomusic.com. For more information about the history and mystery of Bachelors Grove and Bachelors Grove Cemetery, please see Haunted Bachelors Grove by Ursula Bielski, The History Press. Also visit www.thepathtobachelor'sgrove.com.